Welcome back to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I am Adam Young, and I have my guest today is Rebecca Wheeler Walston, who is from Williamsburg, Virginia, currently, where I went to college. So I got to see her this summer when I was back at my alma mater. Rebecca, it's good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks, Adam. Good to see you again.
Say a little bit about what you spend your time doing, a bit about who you are.
So, I am first probably a wife and a mother of two teenagers. So, that is always good space, eventful space, and sometimes stressful space. I live in Williamsburg with my husband of 21 years. And to this day, he is one of my favorite people on the planet. My marriage is definitely a place of rest and grace and peace. And so, yeah, I prefer to spend my time with him above just about anybody else. Um, I am a trained attorney by choice, and I run a practice in Williamsburg that specializes in faith based law. And I also have a master's in counseling and spend some time working with the Allender Center doing some trauma work.
So let's talk a little bit about story. For you, how did you get interested in this work of engaging story?
In undergrad, I had of someone give me a copy of Dan Allender's book, The Wounded Heart. It's the only piece of literature that I knew about him. It's the only time that I really heard his name. And that book was instrumental, probably in my emotional and mental health through undergrad, and really in a lot of ways my spiritual formation, even in undergrad. And so, used the book, you returned to it often, gave away multiple copies, used it really as a blueprint for kind of engaging my own story. Trauma is not a new thing for me in terms of where I come from, but learning how to engage it well and release it to God, it is a difficult thing and something that I've worked to discover multiple times over the years. And so fast forward, 30 years later, and in my work as an attorney, I had an opportunity to come across Dan Allender at an event and walked up to him and to express my gratitude for the book, The Wounded Heart, and what it meant to me. And I met a number of people from the Allender Center who were at the event, and that was my first sort of entry into looking at trauma as a landscape or a lens or a frame through which we can understand ourselves and understand the God we serve, and in many ways the calling that we might have on our lives.
After you read The Wounded Heart, like how did that book affect you in college?
I come out of a background that has multiple kinds and layers of abuse in it. And remember in college running across a Oprah Winfrey show where she was discussing her own trauma and talking about how when you encounter trauma that's that severe, the possibility of healthy adult relationships with men is a near impossibility. And at the time, I was a young Christian and remember thinking, literally, oh God, I hope that isn't true. Like my wish, my prayer in this moment was, please let there be another alternative for a child of God other than an adult life that is tethered to this inability to make healthy, intentional, generous connections to people and actually like rest in and revel in what that would look like or feel like. And so the book, The Wounded Heart, really just gave me like the opportunity to test out that hypothesis, like to put that sort of dare to God himself and see if he was who he says he was, and if Calvary was as revolutionary as it purports to be, and to see if he would meet me in that space. And to my surprise, like he did.
And as you began to dive deeper into your story, what were the obstacles that were hard to overcome?
I mean, I would say in the beginning, it's can I actually name the kinds of trauma? And in some ways, in the beginning, like Wounded Heart gave me language to be able to name categories like sexual abuse. But I found I was in my 20s when I hit that book, and I find about once a decade some new layer of a category of trauma or the way that it affects me tends to rise to the surface. And so even now, several years later, I find myself still like navigating and uncovering like new language, new vocabulary for the kinds of trauma, and how it affects me. So a part of it is being able to actually call an event, an incident, trauma, to call it not okay, to call it bad, to call it something that's hostile to the person of Jesus Christ. I think the other part is learning to be able to actually identify how that trauma ripples out into my own personal decisions. Where are the places where I find myself sort of freezing or paralyzed into to stepping into something that I want, or something that I desire, or stepping into the invitation or the offer for a relationship, for connection, for care. And I find it's sneaky often the ways and hidden the ways in which those invitations come to me, and the ways that I read them as dangerous or unavailable to me, and the skilled ways in which I can say no to those things without really admitting that I'm saying no. And so learning to uncover all that landscape and choosing to say yes, like all those things feel like obstacles that I'm still learning.
Hmm. What's been most helpful for you, Rebecca, as you've engaged your story? I mean, it started with the wounded heart, but that was a while ago. As you've continued to engage your story, what's been some of the more helpful things for you towards that end?
Even when I didn't recognize it, there's probably two or three people over the years that God has intentionally placed in my path to sort of stand in the gap, to fill in gaps where trauma has actually robbed me from connection and attunement and just care. And so one of those people is a woman who stepped in as a mother figure when I was a teenager. One of them is a dear friend who's much more like a sister to me than anyone has ever been, that I met in my 20s, and then my husband as well. Part of it, I think, is just really good, generous care for people who are willing to like stick it out with you, even when your trauma is the thing that is the biggest roadblock to them actually getting to you. People who are willing to kind of fight for you on your behalf and see things in you that you can't see for yourself. So those three people are just markers to me of ways that Jesus pursues persistently, intentionally. Those relationships are really helpful. I mean, and there's a level of transparency, there's a level of vulnerability, permission, or freedom to be like, this is my story. In all of its ugliness and all of its difficulty and all of its pain, those three people allow me to say all of those things without apology or explanation. And then there's just like a sort of a ride or die sense that they give you, like, doesn't matter what you say, how you say it, like, I'm not going anywhere. Some of the work of the Allender Center, and the ability to give vocabulary and categories, is helpful for me to understand the landscape that I move in, and helpful for me to identify like ways in which the trauma affects me that's even hidden. So like my own sort of internal understanding of my world and how I live in it, and then externally these people who walk with me through it, and suffer all of my stumbles, and celebrate all of my triumphs.
And it's hard to overstate how important it is to have one, two, three, four other people who can bear witness to our narrative and simply hear it, hold it, engage us about it, but who are strong enough to bear witness to it, who don't shy away from it, who don't run away from it. And it's hard to find those people, but you have had some of those people.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and maybe at the time when I encountered people, sometimes I'm wise enough to realize this is a profoundly significant connection that I need to actually honor. And sometimes not. Sometimes it takes a couple times for me to realize, oh, this is Jesus in hands, feet, face. This is his voice that showed up in an unsuspecting way at just the right time.
It's clear to me that Jesus has been a companion with you on this healing journey in very kind of personal and important ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I don't know how you do this without a sense of yea, though you walk through the valley, I'm with you.
How have you experienced the presence of Jesus in the context of your, like, the grit of your healing journey, Rebecca? What's that looked like for you?
Couple things. One is I spent my early 20s at a church under the care of a pastor who was very insistent that I spend time memorizing some key scriptures to such a degree that, like, when you need it, when you least expect it, when you think it has nothing to do with the circumstance you're in, it floats across your mind and it knocks around in your heart. That foundation of having a handful of key scriptures, one of which for me, it comes out of the 27th Psalm that says, I would have despaired unless I believed I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And I come from a spiritual background where you could sort of put it all off till glory, right? You can sort of, I will endure all this crazy on earth and then my salvation will come in eternity. But that verse means to me, like, in the land of the living, I will see the goodness of God. Scriptures like that, like, are part of the anchor. I'm a huge believer in, those three or four people that I identified. That's not coincidence. That's not accident, right? It's like the providence of a sovereign God who knows sometimes before we do, this is the person you need. And this is the person you need in a way that I have gifted them and tasked them with the capacity to hold all that you are, no matter what it is. Those people, those faces, that it's hands, feet, face, voice of God in ways that I never expected. That's what I would need. Wasn't always wise enough to know that's what to ask for or dare to hope for. Those relationships mean Jesus sees me and he doesn't forget.
I'm struck as you're talking, like, I know the story you're about to read, and it's a story in which you are harmed by Christian leaders pretty significantly. And yet, right now, what you're putting words to is how Jesus has met you through other Christians, through the church, through the brothers and sisters in Christ. And I'm just aware of the difficulty, the ambivalence of holding the reality that very often, for many of us, we have had really good experiences with Christians in terms of helping us see the hands and feet and hear the voice of God. And we have had really harmful experiences also. How have you, Rebecca, before I ask you to read your story, how have you kind of held that paradox? What's it been like for you to experience both such sweetness and rescue and bearing witness from these three or four people and others in your life, and at the same time experience such harm from the church?
I think my faith has always been intensely personal. Like, I sort of came out of the wound in active trauma. And
Mm.
so I have always needed a God who was capable of doing the impossible. I was not one of those people who felt like because I love Jesus, that means bad things that should not or will not happen to me. Right. And I'm aware for lots of people, like, that's a very real question and a very real struggle. But for me, trauma is such a normative experience that when I came to God, it was with this sense of, like, you better be who these people are saying you are. I sort of kind of always am on a dare with God, like, you better be who you say you are, right? And and every time, like, he meets me right there and is like, I'm absolutely who you think I am, right? And then, so let's go. That grounds me in ways that actually allows me to be like, If you challenge who he has proven himself to be, to me, I have no problem understanding the difference. I can sort of tell that's you and your issue, and that doesn't necessarily translate to God for me. That's not to say that I don't struggle. There's not to say there aren't places where I worry about, is God really, like, the next level, is he going to be there, and the one after that, are you going to be over here? But I can say every time I have put that challenge to him, he has met me exactly where I've been, and so I can rest in the history of that, in the familiarity of that.
So you've volunteered graciously, generously to read a story. Would you be willing to read it now, Rebecca?
Yeah, yeah, I would. My master's program was coming to a close. Most of what remained was to complete my supervised clinical hours in the school sponsored clinic at my small seminary. I was surprised to be called into a meeting with the director of the program and the head supervisor of the counseling clinic. As I sat across from them both in the cramped campus office, I was utterly shocked to learn that the subject of the meeting was a complaint lodged against me. The anonymous they believed that my disability was a distraction in the clinic, which made it difficult for counseling clients to connect with me. Specifically, my struggle to make eye contact was making clients uncomfortable. Stunned and numb, I asked which of my clients complained. I insisted that I was willing to speak with each of them and do what I could to repair the damage. I was told that the complaint did not come from a client, but from a classmate, a member of my small group. Who? I asked. Who is making this claim? As my mind raced, I formulated a plan to talk to my small group. I'd been with these people for a year and a half. I could explain that my lazy eye was a result of cerebral palsy, that I had dozens of surgeries as a child to preserve my sight, and that my brokenness came at the hands of others. They would understand that I never meant for people to feel uncomfortable. Despite my numerous questions and assurances, I was informed that I would not be told which classmate lodged the complaint. I would not be allowed to perform in the clinic unless I agreed to a set of rules. At the first session with all new or prospective clients, I was to introduce myself and inform the client that I have cerebral palsy. I was then to explain that cerebral palsy affected my ability to make eye contact. And finally, I was to let the client know that if this made them uncomfortable in any way, that I would be happy to refer them to another counselor. Only then would I be allowed to address what brought the client into the clinic. Finally, I was informed that all of my sessions would be supervised to ensure that I complied. I don't remember leaving the office, but I do remember choosing to confront my small group. We all sat in one of the small group rooms on campus, cuddled into the couches and chairs with the doors closed. As always, the bland beige room was too cramped and far too warm. I was so nervous I could barely catch my breath, but I was determined. If only I could explain and make them understand, then I would not have to face the excruciating humiliation. I wouldn't have to lead out of my deepest weakness. We'd been together day after day for 18 months. We knew details, hopes, dreams, disappointments about each other. I took as deep as a breath as I could, and I settled into my chair with my arms wrapped around a pillow, and I calmly explained about the meeting. And then I asked the $1 million question: who went to the director? Why didn't you come to me, to the group? Silence met my questions. Blank stares were followed by simple, quiet denials, one after another, until there was no one left. Not a single person admitted to going to the director. One, in his very gentle tone, expressed his grief that this was happening. Another asked for some specific details about CP, remarking that is never a subject I spoke of, and that he was grateful that we could now speak of it. I pleaded one last time. I begged, just tell me, because this is a seminary of all places, and I cannot believe that someone had a big enough issue and yet never spoke to me before going to leadership. I told them I didn't see how we could move on as a group without some sense of honesty. Deafening silence was all that met my ears. In a last ditch effort to preserve what felt like any sense of me, I asked for a second meeting with the leadership of my program. Unable to focus on much else, I agonized over the complaint and the proposed solution constantly. I dreaded nighttime when there wasn't enough activity to occupy my mind, leaving me with no choice but to relive the meeting on a relentless loop. I lay awake night after night, sobbing, so grieved that my skin felt too tight, so heartbroken that I couldn't catch my breath until I felt nothing but a desperate longing for sunlight to show itself. I saw no other choice but to fight and to try. So this time, I didn't go into the meeting unprotected. My husband was at my side, and together we walked back into the office and sat across from the director of the program and the head supervisor of the counseling clinic. I tried to explain how I objected to their solution, how I couldn't see how they would want me to lead out of a disability, how I fought my entire life to lead with me, my intellect, my insight, my strength, and not my broken body. But their answer was swift and resolute. My refusal meant that I cared more about myself than my clients. And if I was not willing to place my clients' needs over my own discomfort, then perhaps I shouldn't be doing this work. With each response, I shrank into my chair, arms wrapped around the middle, weeping, only to feel my husband's arm draw me to his side. My sobs were met with silence and the declaration from the director of the clinic who said she could not understand my tears. Her final judgment, if I did not comply, I would be asked to leave the program. So on my scheduled night to staff the clinic, one last time, I looked for help, desperate for a way out. Before I saw the new client, I asked my supervisor if they were right, if my disability was a distraction. I begged her, do I have to do this? And with tears in her eyes, she whispered yes. I walked into my session and greeted my client with a smile and began, my name is Rebecca and I have CP.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca, for reading that. Thank you. At the beginning of your story, you're in a meeting. You don't know why. You're told, and it's with the leadership. It's with the head of your seminary program and the head of the counseling, the supervisor of the counseling clinic, and you're a counseling student, a master's in counseling student. They tell you that there's been a complaint against you. What happens inside you at that point?
Probably like racing heartbeat, like instant sort of anxiety. I don't think that there was a sense of like being caught, right? Like I think my initial like instantaneous reaction is there's got to be a mistake, right? That somehow something was misread, misunderstood, miscalculated.
Let me just say a few words about this, because at this point in the story, when I hadn't read the rest, when you sent it to me ahead of time, and I'd only read this paragraph, what's happening for me is there's this profound sense of something is really off here. And that's because you're in a Christian environment. Okay. You're in a church environment, a seminary, and these are not just the leaders. They're like the leaders of the leaders. They run the program. They would have known that the scripture is clear about what's supposed to happen when someone has a complaint against you. Anyone who's spent any time in Christian leadership knows that Matthew 18, like the back of their hand. And Matthew 18 is where Jesus says, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. And if they listen to you, you have won them over. So the director of your seminary program knows this. This person knows Matthew 18. He knows what it's supposed to say, what he is supposed to say when a student comes to him with a complaint about another student. He's supposed to say, okay, well, have you gone to to your sister and talked about it? Have you pointed out her fault? So right from the beginning of your story, I know that something, at this point, I'll just say something not right is going on. It's clear by the end of the story that something really wicked is happening. But at this point, it's just something's not right, because the head of your seminary program knows what he's supposed to do when somebody brings a complaint against another student. There's a reason that he's not asking the other student to talk to you. What are your thoughts and feelings as I say all this? Like, what's happening for you?
I have to say, Adam, as long as I've lived with this story, it never crossed my mind to imagine what you just said. Like, even though I said to you just a second ago, like, I knew without hearing the complaint that like there must have been some kind of error. I think I still have this automatic switch that's like it's up to me to fix it. It's up to me to set it right. Like, I'm not even sure that I had an expectation of them to do what you just suggested, which I have some curiosity about what what that is for me to not have thought or expected that those in authority would come to my aid.
Right. That's a great sentence. To not have expected that those in authority would advocate for you, would come to your aid. Like, that wasn't on your radar.
Yeah.
It gets worse because you're told in this meeting that they're not going to reveal to you who complained. They tell you it's not a client. Your initial thought is, oh, a client, and you want to make it right with the client. But then they say, oh, no, 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 we're not hearing this from clients. This is one of your colleagues. This is another student in the program who has made this complaint against you. What do you imagine happened inside of you, Rebecca, when you were told, by those in authority that your accuser's identity is going to be kept confidential, secret?
Yeah, I don't know that it ever crossed my mind to say like I have a right to know. I think where I end up going with it is like I can see how you want to protect them. Like I can see how it might be hard for them to step into this conversation. And now that I'm talking to you about it, it's like, wow, why is my attention always on everybody else, in the story? Again, I think I did it. I dealt with it the only way that I knew how. I mean, I think you can hear in the story all of my internal dialogue about like, I'll just explain some more. I'll just work harder. I'll try more.
Yes. As I got to this part of the story, what I was thinking is, if you had been in a corporate environment, any company in the United States, or if you had been in the justice system of the United States, the legal system of the United States, you would have been granted the decency of knowing who your accuser was. So, how is it that in the church you are not afforded the same level of decency that you would have been afforded in any company or in the United States legal system? Like, that's what's going through my mind at this point. And what I'm feeling is just is incredulity and fury. At this point of the story, there are really two data points that something really wicked is happening. Number one is you're not being told who your accuser is, and the other was the first thing that we talked about. And so it's clear to me that there's something going on that's really wicked. What's it like for you now to ponder that?
Still, I think hard for me to hold on to, right? Like I still have a sense, even as I listen to you talk, where I'm just like, but these are God's people. Like, I mean, do you know, like it's very hard for me to be talking about people who profess the name of Jesus in the same sentence as like as wicked. Because you're not talking about wicked in the sense of like, I made a mistake. This story is like there's a lot of planning there and there's a ton of follow through. It's still hard for me to hold. These are like the leaders of the next generation of Christian pastors, counselors, and these people. Yeah, the word wicked is very hard for me to hold that in reference to these people. There's so much dissonance there.
Yes. And this is what happens anytime we experience harm from the church or from Christian leaders, there is always this dissonance of how could the people of God be doing this? And the temptation is to think, all right, I must be misunderstanding what's going on here.
Yeah.
And you're nodding your head. And my guess is that's what was happening in your heart at this meeting.
Yeah, it's like it must be me. They must be right. I must have somehow not played this right. Like I made a misstep somewhere in the way that I show up in the room, in the space, and so I just need to do better. And so it's hard for me to I hear your sense of incredulity, and I mean I hear it internally. I still have a sense of like it must be me because I don't have a category for people who love Jesus to make these kind of moves.
Yes. Their solution, their instruction to you is that you will need to say some things to your clients. And they tell you the three things that you need to say. And you use the word, and it's a great word, humiliation. There's something humiliating in what they are asking you to do. Any sense, Rebecca, on why these two leaders single you out for humiliation?
Ugh, right? I can barely hold that these people love Jesus and they're doing this, right? And to try to get anywhere near like why? What is it? I'm gonna say this, like what did I do to invite that kind of something? Maybe it's anger, maybe it's rage. I mean, like it feels so mean. Mean in a way of like, have you no heart? It does defy logic to me. It's like it's a basic level of compassion. But I'm telling you, they were looking at me like I have no idea what you're talking about, and I have no idea why you're upset. Like it's the most preposterous thing that you're even shedding a single tear. I mean, like what's knocking around in me is like, God damn, you must have hated me. I can't for the life of me figure out what I did to invite that kind of energy.
Right. That's a great word. There is an energy in this exchange that is massive. And what I'm curious about is, to what degree is that energy envy? And I don't expect you to know an answer to that,
Yeah.
but it's the only way I know how to make sense of this story. Otherwise, the story feels incoherent to me because something is driving these two leaders to humiliate you.
I never understand the category of envy aimed at me. I just like what goes through my mind is like, oh my God, if you only knew, you would never trade places with me. Not even like not even for a second. And so how could you possibly, and I'm gonna say this, like in your fully able-bodied self, on what planet, what logic leads you to actually envy someone that suffers the way I suffer?
Mhm.
Right? I don't know how you get there. I have no idea how in your brain you get there.
Yeah, and let me be clear, I'm not suggesting they envy your cerebral palsy. I'm suggesting that they were envying something of your gifting.
And I assume that's what you meant, but I'm still like, good God, how could you possibly like if you knew what it cost, you would never like envy is not the word.
If you knew what my gifting cost me, that's what I'm hearing you say. So your gifting and let's be clear, you are a very young therapist, right? You're a therapist in training. But my contention is that there was something of your gifting, I don't know what, but something of the way you engaged with clients or engaged with other people in your cohort that activated the envy of one of your classmates, because that classmate went above you and said, she's doing some things that are wrong, and you program director and clinical supervisor, need to take some action here because this is wrong. There's so much energy bent on your humiliation.
I mean, it's the kind of thing that just makes me want to fade into the background, right? It's like, yeah, I'd rather just you not notice if this is what you're going to do with it.
Yes. Yes. And for those people who have experienced envy, I think that is a very common kind of wish. The wish to not be seen, therefore I won't be envied, therefore I won't be hated or have to suffer the contempt that you're going to give me.
And I did that. Like, I left the program, didn't get a license, and went back to being a practicing attorney. And I don't think I knew at the time that it was in response to that. Like, I remember leaving the meeting and just thinking, well, I got to get my degree. So either I'm gonna walk away and leave the degree on the table 6 months shy of graduation, or I'm gonna do what they say and get my degree, right? And if you know me, like I would never leave that on the table. So I swallowed everything I could swallow, did what they said, got my degree, but I left the profession. And it's only in the last 5 years or so that I've even revisited the possibility that I should have been doing the work.
And so in that sense, Rebecca, and I'm not assuming that you will become more active in therapeutic work, or leave law. I'm not presuming any of that. I'm simply saying it is possible that the broader enemy, namely the structures of evil that are arrayed against us, was intent on keeping you from practicing therapeutic work because this was an event that leveled you and that resulted in you returning to law.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not assuming that you shouldn't be practicing attorney. I'm simply saying that this was a monumentally transformative event for you that affected the course of your vocational life.
And I don't think I knew that, like I do have a sense of like just feeling like they held all the cards and all the power, right? Like I knew that because you're literally holding my degree in your hand. When I left the profession, I was like, this isn't for me. I'm not passionate enough about it. Like all these reasons, right, that don't really have anything to do. And I stepped out of law and into that program on a scripture from the book of Jude that talks about turning pruning shears into weapons of war. And a very clear sense from Jesus that like the very trauma that you have overcome is the thing that will become your ability to stand against the kingdom of darkness. Right. And so I went to get that master's degree to do that, to see something that had been a pruning for me in terms of my own personal growth become something that I can advocate on behalf of others. I'm a lawyer. I get paid to advocate, and you can hear why. So it's taken me years to figure out. Holy crap! What actually happened in that building is much bigger than a director of a program and a student.
Say more about that, Rebecca. What happened is bigger.
There are themes and threads to trauma, right? That my particular trauma has a theme to it, and so does yours, but your theme is likely different than mine, and your thread is different than mine, right? And if I actually believe that there is a God and there's also an enemy that opposes, right? That enemy is calculating and smart and pays attention. There's a reason for the theme to the trauma that I encounter, right? And I believe that theme is actually connected to my gifting, right? I think the enemy is smart enough to know what my gifting is, right? And I think he's smart enough to set his hands to actually undo it. And so if that's true, that means that conversation was what you said. It's about like the undoing of my gifting and my calling. I could be buried under some guilt and shame for the fact that I walked away from it for a couple decades, or I can be kind and generous to myself and be like, of course you did. And it's never too late.
Right.
and I can go back to that dare with Oprah Winfrey and be like, he better be who he says he is. And my gifting will still come forward if I have the courage to step into it. And so I didn't then, but I'm learning to now.
Every story has detours. Every story worth telling, worth living, involves the assaults of the kingdom of evil against the glory and gifting of the human heart, of yourself. And each story, my own, all the stories that I have engaged, involves significant, sometimes decades long detours where it appears that there was either a setback or it appears that the enemy won in some way. Your story is not over. What I do know about you is that you are not only an attorney, you are also doing therapeutic work on a regular basis with the Allender Center. I know you're not a practicing therapist, but you do therapeutic work, and I think you enjoy it. And so, to whatever degree this assault, this humiliating assault against you, when you were very young and in training by Christian leaders, to whatever degree that assault has caused a detour, it has not had the final say.
Ty Tribbett has this song. There's a line in it that says, like, if you only knew what your attack would do to me, you wouldn't have done it in the first place. I have some curiosity about, like, yeah, it was a detour, but maybe, just maybe, right? It's actually a detour to my advantage. The very thing that was meant to take you out actually makes you an even more formidable foe on behalf of the kingdom. And so I'm all for that.
Rebecca, thank you for your vulnerability today, for reading this story publicly, a story of such heartache. It's been an honor to be with you.
I have to say the same is true, Adam. I don't know, I would have trusted the story to very many people. So I'm grateful for this space between you and I.